Hi everyone, just bear with me while we just wait for everyone to attend. Randomly happen to be in Denmark, in Copenhagen at the moment. There's a sort of measure camp on Saturday, so I'm arriving ahead of time. But hence why my background kind of looks like a hotel room, because it is. But today we're going to just talk about a sort of consent mode, and it's kind of timely because Google sort of in the last week or so have rolled out some consent mode features to GA4. Before, there wasn't really much you could kind of do with consent mode, and there weren't really huge benefits from using it. But now they're in effect making it so that as part of Google Signals, that kind of upscaling of users that have either denied cookies or sort of 2-second timeout has expired and they haven't accepted. That information is basically used to X up. So for instance, if 10 or 15% of people have opted out, then the 85% is times by the missing 15% to basically rescale conversions and session numbers. So we'll actually, it's probably worth putting that link to the Google thread about that in the chat window, but we'll also kind of talk about it in a minute. So I'm just going to start sharing screen. Only on one screen on this laptop, so I can't see the chat window, but we'll jump to questions after these slides. So let's just turn on the laser pointer. Okay, sweet. So this is kind of a consent mode and consent mode tools. So we're just going to quickly kind of go over some basics about GDPR and similar cookie classifications, the two main types of classifying cookies, and then the consent mode features within GTM. Just a quick bit about ourselves. So we're a Bristol-based analytics specialist agency, doing a lot of Google Analytics, GTM, GA4 kind of migrations, and heavily involved in like setup and configuration for like sort of large brands in multiple sectors, be it e-commerce, publishing, and B2B. And here's some of the companies that we're working with. Normally tend to be kind of big beasts. But the reason this is important, so GDPR especially affects big companies because of this 2% of global revenue fine. So the larger the company, the higher the fine that could be, and thus the more important it is to kind of get the compliance bit right. In addition, though, it's not just the fine aspect, it's also the possible kind of PR damage from non-compliance and just kind of good ethos and ethics. So we're just going to kind of go through that now. As I said, our main focus is Google Analytics and GTM, but the kind of the configurations within GTM, they kind of overlap with cookie compliance, because as part of a setup, we normally need to install a cookie management system and make sure that integrates with tags, be it for the different types of tags, be it remarketing, analytics, or functional. Just to start off with, a quick question for the audience, and this is also a chance to just check that the chat window is working. Can you just answer like yes or no? So do you have a cookie banner on your website? Given that it is a talk about compliance and cookie consent, I couldn't kind of get away without asking a question. And so if you just put yay or nay in the chat window, and this just kind of also checks that chat's working. Next question. So as like the audience there, the vast majority have a cookie banner on their site, especially if they're operating in Europe. Next question, do you use a consent management platform? Kind of yes or no. So if you don't know what a consent management platform is, then you're probably not using one. So these are more a kind of a banner that's used for invoking the cookie consent and sort of scanning of the website for cookies, and also rendering the cookies that are found on like a privacy policy page with a dynamic list. Some of them also support kind of training and ability to get kind of user access requests and such. So There are ways of doing it using custom or open source scripts if you're not using a cookie management platform. So SiteBeam had quite a good open source script, which was free. Although nowadays it tends to be more cookie consent management systems. I mean, the ones that we most often encounter tend to be either Cookiebot or OneTrust, occasionally TrustArc in the US, and Civic in the UK. Normally have certain things that are different between each ones, and depending on the number of subdomains on a site, they affect kind of which one is best or most kind of cost effective. If you're using one of the two probably most popular ones, Cookiebot or OneTrust, I'm kind of curious to know, do you use the auto blocking feature within that? So auto blocking is where it will classify cookies kind of on the fly. So it will scan the website and say, okay, this is an AdWords remarketing tag, put it in the targeting bucket. This is a Google Analytics tag, put it in the analytics bucket, or this is a live chat tag, put it in functional, or it's a PHP cookie or a CDN cookie or security cookie, and it is needed for the website to work, put it in the strictly necessary. So the automatic blocking that uses the Cookiepedia database, and it puts those into buckets for you. So there's not really a human involved in that bit, although you can override the settings or the bucket that it puts it into. The manual blocking is more where you're using GTM consent mode, and you decide which categories cookies should go into. So auto block with a little bit of editing. Okay, generally the bigger companies tend to use auto block for kind of almost like defensive measures. However, personally, my experience would be try not to use auto block where possible, because it can really impact site speed and performance. And also there's some areas which are a little bit kind of gray, such as the AdWords conversion cookie, which kind of gets put into the remarketing bucket, but actually it's kind of borderline a performance cookie. So in that situation, the manual blocking does give you more control. So personally, I normally recommend like using manual blocking, but just being a little bit careful when you originally kind of set it up. So I'll come back to the difference between these two later on in these slides, and then the pros and cons of each. And then another question, do you use Google Tag Manager? Or maybe actually what I probably should have asked on this is, do you use Google Tag Manager to deploy your cookie banner? So if you're using auto block, then you would not use GTM to deploy the cookie banner. The reason for that is auto block is synchronous. So it has to run before everything else runs. And obviously GTM is asynchronous, so it's not possible to inject a synchronous script into GTM. So if you ticked auto block in the first one, then you must not be using GTM. If you are, then you're going to hit problems. So annoyingly within GTM, there's not like a free kind of cookie banner in the same way that there's not like a template to say, for instance, like Facebook has a chat template, but there's not, which does a little kind of live chat pop-up, but there's not a native template within GTM for like a Google cookie banner. However, there are templates for some of the providers that I've mentioned, where they'll basically invoke a cookie banner kind of on load. So the other question here, and this feeds into the next one, is how many visitors you have on your website. So are you in the kind of green, amber, or red zones? The reason why this is important is that the bigger the site, or the more users that are active on it, the larger the risk and the larger the fine. So those 4% of global revenue, they're kind of weighted by the number of users or citizens that are affected by something. So if you look at kind of class actions and fines for compliance in general, it could be, let's say, like a £5 fine per user that's had a compliance issue or compliance breach sort of thing. So hence, if you've got 100,000 users or 1 million users in a month, then that's like £1 million fine potentially. although I think it's there is a cap on it, but it's something like 20 billion or something like that. So like a crazy amount in terms of the cap. But it normally the larger the number, the more of a risk there is, and the more importance you want to kind of set this up properly. So as I said, GDPR is all about permission. So if you ask for a kind of a positive opt-in and you get consent, then that's your kind of bulletproof defense. So you've asked the question, the user said yes, that's fine, and then you're good on that. Important note on this is you have to leave the tick box empty. So that's what they mean by a positive opt-in. So with remarketing, especially on these cookie banners, you have to leave the box unticked in order for it to be compliant. And also, along the same lines, when you show an accept or deny, you must make the boxes as equally easy to click on. So you can't, for instance, make the reject sort of cookies for both analytics and remarketing kind of white on white, and then the agree or accept kind of bright green button. That would be like unfair kind of treatment. And the important bit on this is really a focus on remarketing, because the data passes to third-party networks such as Google Display Network, Facebook, Bing, etc. So that's more of the risk or more of the focus. Analytics, it does get covered for compliance because you are storing cookies and possibly collecting like anonymized IP addresses. And obviously you may have seen in Austria, there was a big thing about unhashed IP addresses are counted as PII. Generally speaking, though, the focus of compliance is always going to be on remarketing, because it's seen as something similar to email, SMS, etc. So if you're using one of these, as in a remarketing network, these are the ones where you definitely need an opt-in for. So if you're loading Facebook, let's say, or AdWords remarketing, and you haven't got a positive acceptance and the user is in Europe, then that's technically non-compliant. So and that would be flagged when you try out any of those cookie compliance kind of scanners. It'll say you haven't got an opt-in. And you should do. This is more targeted at consumer, so B2C sites. On B2B, there's less of a focus because the compliance is largely targeted at consumers and protecting consumers. So the other one you might have noticed on that list is Google Analytics is kind of in that list. Why is Google Analytics in a remarketing network list? Well, let me show you why. It's because if you don't edit the settings within firstly, with Google Analytics, you can tick a box, which means that the Google Analytics first-party tracking pixel can then be used for remarketing. So it does a relay. It goes to Google Analytics servers, and then it pings along as a redirect through to DoubleClick. So you have to be slightly careful about the Google Analytics tag in that instance. However, you can set it to analytics only mode. But you would need to do that by using the setting here called allow ad features and setting that to off by default until you've had a positive opt-in. The same applies on GA4, where you have to use these two settings for Google Ad Signals and Personalize, and these should be off by default. And an important note again on compliance, if you're using GA3 and you haven't turned on anonymized IP, like do so now, because there's already kind of privacy hunters kind of looking for sites that are non-compliant and flagging those sites and sort of kind of reporting them. So just very important you switch that anonymized IP to true on GA3. On GA4, it's automatically set to anonymized IP true already, so you don't need to worry about it there. If you're using consent mode, that actually takes care of these features for you. In effect, it overrides the allow ad signals and personalize. So you don't actually need to worry about the settings if you're using consent mode within GTM. So consent mode, Google with their kind of wisdom, or not maybe, have created 5 different categories for putting cookies into. So you've got your standard remarketing or ad storage, your analytics, and then your functional, and then the strictly necessary is not on that list because obviously they're allowed by default. The normally like security cookies are kind of like strictly necessary. I don't really know why they split out personalization with a Z in there, it's basically the same as analytics cookies. So basically that maps to these categories here. So ad storage is remarketing, analytics and analytics, functional, etc. So the way that that's set, so the first thing, if you want to use GTM consent mode, you have to turn it on container level. So we normally recommend creating a development container and a live container. So in this instance, you could go in and tick the box to turn on that setting on the development container. What that then does is it allows you to then go into any tag and put a tag into a particular kind of bucket, be it, you know, analytics, remarketing, etc. And also worth noting that a tag can actually be in two categories. So for example, if you are using the Google Analytics remarketing features, then that would be in both analytics and ad storage. So here's an example of where you would set that setting. And that would then mean that you would have to have a granted or allow on ad storage in order for this tag to fire. It works a little bit like blocking rules, but it's just native within the tag. One thing to kind of note, which is a bit of a gotcha kind of on this, is, or two gotchas actually. The first thing, if you're using any like custom scripts, so in this case here, I don't actually, this is a kind of a bit of a, just to check people are paying attention, with the Hotjar client ID, it's actually not necessary to set this if you're using a custom script. The reason for that is that if I've set the Hotjar kind of tag to an analytics, then any custom JavaScript which is invoking a Hotjar kind of push event, that code itself is going to require like an analytics consent. So we actually normally recommend setting this to not set for any scripts that are in effect just declaration scripts. So maybe another good example of that would be a HTML5 video listener, which doesn't actually store any cookies or doesn't set any HTML5 local storage, but it does push data layer events. We've actually seen instances of where when we've tried to set the consent mode for these custom scripts, it actually causes them to stop working. So we actually recommend custom scripts normally setting them to not set, but obviously if your UA page views, UA events, and the Hotjar page views, they would need something configured or set within this. Those are the categorizations. And there's also a report where you can view the cookies in a kind of an overall list to see which categories you've put them into. So this is when consent mode is enabled, there's this little badge that appears in the top right that allows you to see this report, and it also shows you stuff that's not been put into a particular bucket above, and then ones that have been marked. Just another kind of gotcha or really important thing to be aware of, the built-in consent field here is really confusing for most people because it doesn't really do anything. So the built-in consent, all it really means is that that particular tag is reading that value, but it doesn't mean that it's stopping that value from being set. So in this instance here, where there's like, let's say an AdWords conversion, that actually really also needs to be set to, let's say, an analytics storage if you're treating AdWords conversions as performance cookies. So if I just show you what I mean by that, on here, if I just jump to GTM for a second. So it's this box here, the little tick box, and here's a built-in consent sort of cookie here, and if I, for instance, pick cookie bot as an example, so the cookie bot banner here, it reads these consent values, but it's not blocked by any consent. So that's what I mean by the built-in consent sort of field here. It basically is just really used for does, let's say, the conversion linker read ad storage, but it doesn't actually stop that from firing. The thing that would stop it from firing, or in effect block the tag, would be the required consent. So just be aware that this is the built-in consent check does not stop it from firing. The important bit really is this require a consent here. So just that's what needs to be configured. Also, there's a little bit of a kind of gray area on the AdWords conversion linker one, because that affects both the AdWords conversion pixel, because it's used to store a cookie or the GCLID cookie on landing page, which was recalled on the AdWords on a thank you page. So personally, I put that in analytics sort of storage, and then put the remarketing one in ad storage, and also on the same on the AdWords conversion. I personally put that into analytics storage, and then the remarketing is under ad storage. So if you want to check that consent mode is working, so the new GTM preview window now shows if a tag is blocked or accepted due through to consent mode. But you can also add, let's say in this case, I'm pushing a console log to say if it's denied and then changed to granted. So that also kind of works. So let me also just give you an example of that. So the way we normally just kind of sanity check those tags would be fire a variable, which would be, let's say, like this one here, where I've got add storage. So there's not a data layer field for getting the consent mode value. So you have to basically loop through the data layer, can find the kind of argument that's set to consent, and then get .add storage for that. It's a little bit sort of fiddly. I mean, there are variables which kind of do this, but they basically run exactly the same code as this. So this will output either a granted or a denied or an empty. And we push that normally into a console log, just so we can kind of sanity check it and double check that like the defaults are working and an on-click acceptance is working as expected. But you can also look for the instance in a pixel. If you're for consent mode, you'd see a parameter called G100 or G11, and that tells you if it, in effect, it's a denied or granted as well in the actual pixel request. So if you want to check your website is compliant, there's Cookiebot have quite a nice little kind of quick scanner. So you can kind of go there, enter your site, and it will basically tell you how many cookies it's found and where it thinks you're compliant or not. And they do that check for free. And they also have a nice report for showing the count of people that have opted out or opted in. So when I was talking earlier about consent mode with, that time zing by, in this case, there's 56 people that have opted out. So those would be the ones that would be kind of upscaled if you had consent mode active. Another good area to check, and this is to determine the impact of kind of opt-outs, is look at the count of clicks from AdWords versus the count of Google CPC sessions. So in here, maybe we'll share a link to this Data Studio template. You can see the difference here is close to about 14% missed. So obviously, if you've got a lot of clicks and not as many sessions, then there's potentially an issue with and a need for using consent mode to kind of rescale those numbers back up. And also, we've noticed a kind of gradual shift. So you can see it actually on this slide. So this one here, it started at like 96%, and over time, more and more users have become concerned about sort of cookies and compliance and etc. And especially if they're on Apple and Safari, and hence, there's a bigger chunk that's being kind of cut off. So on that question earlier about whether you're using auto block or manual blocking. So this is just a quick kind of grid if you were going to decide which one to go for. And the key thing really here is all about site speed in this case here. So auto block is really bad for site speed. It's a synchronous script. You got like an SEO sort of render blocking warning, and it basically stops everything else from running and does a kind of a mutate observer listener for all JavaScript tags and changes to JavaScript tags on the site. Not great for site speed, but it's quite good in terms of obviously nothing can get past it for compliance. So the risk of stuff sneaking through is very low, assuming that it's crawled a site and not someone's added a cookie which is not being detected. However, it's quite restricted in terms of what you can adjust within some of the settings, whereas on manual mode you get full flexibility. And potentially more expensive. So personally, I normally always recommend trying to go for manual mode where possible because of those site speed benefits. If you do use auto block, it's super important that you set GTM to as an ignore or as basically as a strictly necessary. If you're using auto block and you haven't done this, you get roughly about 2% of traffic not tracked. So super important. This is the basically an ignore on Cookiebot, and the OneTrust does a very similar thing. So this is both of them here. So this is the attribute which basically puts this script into a strictly necessary category. So it's never like slowed down from loading and never stopped from loading. I think actually I said 3% traffic on that one. It's basically definitely a gotcha if you turned on auto block and you haven't got that setting configured. So as a key action from this webinar, add those 3 lines of code if you're using auto block. And then the other one is on the sort of banner types themselves. So there's really kind of two ways of doing it. Either a sort of floating footer or a modal kind of cookie wall. Oops, sorry, wrong slide. So here's a floating footer example. So it normally slides up from the bottom. These are more on sites where it's kind of a bit more grayer on compliance. So maybe more B2B sites, obviously not banking sites, and maybe sites in America. So these would normally be set with the analytics cookie fired by default. And then a kind of a click to opt in for remarketing. In this case, remarketing is off by default. So if the user passes to the second page, they wouldn't. An analytics tag would fire, but a remarketing tag would not fire. These are gradually becoming less common, and people, I would say, are generally switching over to cookie wall modes, especially for B2C. So you're seeing these sort of the banners kind of shown. So this is the Cookiebot kind of banner. It's worth noting I added an intentional mistake on this one, which is you actually have to add the deny button in red in here as well to make it like strictly compliant. And normally these mean that the user has to accept or reject in order to access the website. So your remarketing list sizes are normally maximized because they have to make a decision in order to use the site. At some point in the future, we're hoping that Google will kind of clear the madness and introduce a native browser-based consent mode or consent banner in the same way that for HTML5, like with the geolocation, there's a native sort of function. It doesn't exist at the moment. I'm sort of still keeping my eyes out for one. And it'd be great when they do, because there's so many different varieties of these cookie banners, and obviously it's not great for site performance. It'd make a lot more sense if it was like a native browser library, but yeah, it's not there yet, unfortunately. But watch this space. If you want a 20% discount on Cookiebot, drop us a message and we can send you a link to get that. But I mean, to be honest, we would rather you just pick a solution that's best for you. So the other bit here is more just going through some tips for Cookiebot and some configuration settings within that. So I'm just going to check on time and questions for a second. I'll actually maybe come back to that. I've only got one screen on here, so we'll have to do questions verbally in a minute. On Cookiebot, if you're adding Cookiebot via GTM, Google recommend you use the feature called consent initialized. However, it doesn't work, unfortunately. So this GTM initialize, what you have to use instead is Cookiebot _ consent updated. So that means that the banner has loaded or an acceptance has been loaded. So that only triggers after accept or after an acceptance cookie it already exists. And you can see it kind of running in here. So there's the standard initialize function. So there's the GTM's consent initialized, and then up here is the consent updated. So that's basically means that Cookiebot has finished executing and reading cookies. On Cookiebot, there's a bit of a gotcha, which is it works on subdomains. So if you forget to add a subdomain, it means that it doesn't render the cookie banner on that domain. So the cookie update doesn't get executed either. So that's a big problem because it can mean that you don't get any tracking on that website. So we always recommend adding a fail-safe, which is we add all the domains that are in the cookie bot kind of whitelist of domains as exceptions, and then everything else we just push a consent updated event. So this then means that there's no risk of a tracking outage, and also on development domains and stuff, they'll still continue to work. So just a cookiebot specific kind of tip on that one. So here's an example where we've got our own domain as a whitelist. So that's basically saying don't fire it on this domain, but everything else do fire it. Couple of other sort of like pro tips. Really annoying feature on cookiebot is that it shows this banner was produced by cookiebot, which is crazy on a paid solution. So you can get rid of that. The help page here that they've provided is not really very helpful. So instead, what you have to do is you have to add a listener that listens for the cookiebot banner is rendered. Then you can push an event, and on that event, you can then inject some JavaScript code that just hides that text saying made by cookiebot. So here's the code that you would add. This removes the powered by logo and the powered by text. So we normally add this on all cookiebot banners, be it footer ones or modal ones, because we don't want like the branding on there for cookiebot. So it then renders like that without the cookiebot banner. The other one is quite a kind of hidden or unknown feature, which is actually quite handy. So a lot of these cookie solutions actually expose the GeoIP country, and they need to do that because there may be IP specific banner that they're trying to load, or certain rules per either in Europe or outside of Europe, etc. That value is actually exposed in JavaScript, so you can actually use it from some quite handy things. So here's two use cases, and these are practical examples that we use that value for. So this one here, after the cookie bot banner is loaded, we read the country code. So in this case, it's UK, and we use it to pre-populate the default value for country here, so the user doesn't need to fill that in. The second thing we use it for is this particular site is running on multiple countries. And for AdWords call tracking, which does an exact pattern match for a phone number, the phone number for a US dial code is different to the number for a UK dial code. So basically, we have two different AdWords call tracking phone numbers for in a lookup table for matching. They say if you're in the UK, look for this ID, and if you're in the US, look for this like phone number. So that's quite helpful because it just means that we can more effectively use like AdWords call tracking in an instance of where they're running in multiple countries. And what's the other one on here? And here's an example of that country value being exposed. So this is in this case, I'm actually in Denmark at the moment, so it says DK as the country code. You could also use that for personalization as well, for let's say a currency value or a flag or other sort of things. And sometimes like GeoIP plugins can be like, let's say, £15 a month. So this is basically a free way of getting the GeoIP. Annoyingly, it doesn't drill down to city. We only get the country for this one, but it's still a nice freebie for those tools. And here's the script that we use to pre-populate the default country field from that GeoIP. Another one, and this comes up a lot again for multi-country setups, is that the client wants to use different logic if someone's in, let's say, Europe or California or Utah, compared to everywhere else. So they want to do an accept options and deny in EU, and then in California, they want to show do not sell my data. And then the rest of the world, they want to just show accept and options. They want to hide the deny button. So that's actually possible to do in cookiebot, and it's possible to do it within GTM for the cookiebot template. However, you have to just tweak it slightly in order for it to work. So, and just before I mention this, just a really important note, if you're using this feature, there's a thing called domain groups within CookieBot, which allow you to set different banner configurations. If you do use this, never add any domains into those domain groups. If you do, you'll get charged twice, so just don't add them. Just have name one of your accounts as sort of modal and scanning, and then the other accounts for, let's say, US, California, and rest of world. And when you do that, when you create these other domain groups, it'll give you a different sort of banner ID here. And normally you change it to manual as well for this. And that ID you then enter into your CookieBot template for, let's say, US or rest of world, etc. So the standard CookieBot code here would change to this one, where it's got the GeoIP region. So this one here, US 6, is California. So when someone is in the US and in California, instead of loading the standard banner here, it loads this different banner. Or if they're matched to these countries, let's say a list of European countries, it loads this banner, et cetera, et cetera. And that's quite fiddly to kind of set up. So what we've done is we've edited the CookieBot standard banner template just to make it really easy to classify these regions. So there we've got Europe, California, Utah, and this ID here would be different for each banner sort of type. So we have submitted this code to the CookieBot sort of repository, but we're still waiting for them to approve it. But if you want to get a free copy of the template we're using for this, just drop us an email and we can email you the template instead. And it did take us a little bit of time to kind of generate this because it's a little bit fiddly to tweak the CookieBot kind of code, but it works like perfectly. And just jumping back to that thing that I mentioned earlier. So this is the kind of GA4 upscaling or kind of a modeling feature. Really potentially useful and a big reason to enable consent mode sort of within GTM. And so I'm just looking how we're doing for time. I'm probably going to jump over to questions now. We also have a GA4 migration checklist. So Sarah asked me to put the link to that in the chat window. So if you want to migrate to GA4 and do consent mode at the same time, which would kind of make sense given that it's the benefits of using it are in GA4, drop us a line. For GA4, you definitely should have your GA4 page view active on the site, given that there's only a month and a year away before GA3 kind of bites the dust. So the sooner you migrate to, or at least get a year's worth of data for your comparisons, the better. These are more. These are more an appendix if you're using the older method called blocking rules rather than consent mode. So I'm just going to now jump to questions, or in fact, actually, Sarah, it'd be better if you want to like read out the questions and see if we've got any good ones in the list.
All right, so let's give everyone just 2 minutes to write down some of the questions, and then we can start from the beginning. There were no particular questions in between. There's just a few comments. So for example, Alan says that for the cookies, he's using Fin Suite.
Okay. I've not heard of that one. So I mean, there are certain cookie banners that are more popular in certain countries. So for instance, User-Centrics appears to be more popular in Germany. Diomi is more popular in France. Civic seems to be more popular in UK. I would say when with User-Centrics, they probably go a bit kind of OTT on granularization because they allow you to opt into individual vendors. And the reality is users don't have the time or interest to do it at a vendor level. They're really only interested in the top level categories.
Maybe a question for Alan, where are you based?
So we're based in the UK, in Bristol, which is like the largest kind of tech centre outside of London. But obviously I'm in Copenhagen at the moment on the sort of the conference tour list. So if anyone's heading to Measure Camp Copenhagen, say hello this Saturday.
Cool. Joe Russ commented, we're using GTM. Maybe we're not auto blocking. So this was just a comment. And we have.
So
go ahead.
So you're probably, well, the way to check would be if you look at the source code of your site and search the word auto block if you're on OneTrust, or just I've forgotten what Cookiebot call it, but you'll see within the JavaScript file which method is currently being used.
Right.
But yeah, if just on that, if you are using auto block or you've turned on auto block and you've got the banner being added within GTM, then yeah, it's definitely not compliant, because GTM is asynchronous. So what would happen is the banner will load, but other code can kind of jump ahead of it.
We have a question from Ryan. Do you have any automation tools that could help with the migration to GA4?
Yes, we do. So we've got our GTM cleaner, which has a GA4 kind of a migration feature within it. So I'm just gonna let me just share screen for a second. So this is I'll just put this link in the chat window, and so this is, if you go to so it's GTM cleaner .measuremindsgroup.com, and within there, in both the pro version and the light version, you should see an option where it says convert GA3 to GA4 tags. On here, you do need to add a GA4 measurement ID, but and you need to either import a GTM JSON file or connect to GTM and select your workspace. But this will then automatically copy those over to from let's say GA3 events to GA4 events. So if it's a big account, this can save a lot of time.
Cool. Ryan also has another question. Have you seen any uptake on the HTTP header do not track?
Not that I'm aware of, but we normally, as part of the templates that we use, so let's say with Cookiebot here, so let me just so we've got like a library of tags that we maintain, of which so here's two examples. This is Cookiebot running in modal mode and footer mode. We'll go into that modal mode. So we normally, as part of the like a standard Cookiebot setup, we would also read the browser do not track here, which is the JavaScript function that all browsers expose. If that's set to true or enabled, then we turn remarketing off. I mean, Google Analytics does actually turn remarketing off when you have that setting configured. But we then also look through that. Then we also check like the Cookiebot kind of analytics storage, granted, denied, and then the data layer value that's output from here as well. So yeah, we do cover it as part of our standard setup, but there's not a browser setting for kind of do not. The thing with do not track is that it means track, not target. There's not a browser setting for do not target. The only thing is there is kind of individual opt-outs that you can do for remarketing networks, and also within I think it's google.com/ad settings. You can actually set it within there. But yeah, there's a good question.
Another question. So do you know of any cookie consent scripts that cause problems with React or other JavaScript frameworks?
So with React sites itself, so we normally recommend Angular Analytics for React, which is kind of a module, and that exposes your kind of your page changes and your page title kind of changes. Although you can also use history listeners as well. There's not really a specific problem with cookie banners on React. It's kind of the same as adding kind of page views. The thing that you do need to be careful about, though, on React sites is you need to be very careful about rogue referral issues. And what I mean by that is when someone lands on a site from, let's say, an AdWords click, so with a GCL ID present, and then they click to a second page on a React site, it causes the session to be split into two halves. The first half being an AdWords click and the second half being an organic click. The reason for that is that there's the Google Analytics kind of location field sort of falls sort of reads the second page value, which doesn't have the GCL ID in it, but the referral sticks to the originating referral, because on a history change, it doesn't cause the referral to change. So in a nutshell, it's more a problem for attribution than it is for cookies on React sites. There are, and with Diomi that we mentioned, they do have a plugin for React, but the Diomi cookie manager is horrible. It's like really like not very easy to use. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's wouldn't say React is the thing there. It's more about just which cookie manager you're most comfortable with kind of using. And also the number of subdomains, which also affect the cost of the cookie manager, and which one's kind of best.
All right, another question, a hard one. Okay. Do you know if we should DNS prefetch the cookie consent? This is JSON script.
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends if it's for strict compliance. So most of the cookie banners will have, well, they'll use kind of CDNs, so that which would geographically resolve to the nearest kind of host. But if you know that a site is, let's say, in Europe, you might want to kind of within the let's say CookieBot or OneTrust kind of file location, you might want to kind of force it to a local like country for the JavaScript file to basically ensure that an IP address, which is part of kind of like the network request, doesn't pass kind of outside of Europe. So I know CookieBot did have some problems with this, because I think one of their hosts was in America, or the networks they're using. But I think now they allow the ability to basically force a particular country as part of their CDN. So in effect, you could kind of override that. Just on that same note, so GA4 is soon going to introduce locally hosted regions for Europe. So for instance, instead of it being a www.google-analytics.com/analytics.javascript, that will change soon to, let's say, eu.google-analytics.com/analytics.javascript. So that solves or gets around the problem of an IP address being sent when the JavaScript file is requested. It's not necessarily a problem with prefetching. It's more of an issue of if a JavaScript file is hosted outside of Europe. I mean, the prefetching itself, and there was a study on this where someone's tried to take CookieBot, I think it was, to court in Germany to argue that the prefetching was like illegal, and they actually lost that court case. I'll try and find the article, but in a nutshell, it only at the moment the problem has more been with Google Analytics 3 with IP addresses being processed in America, as in unhashed IP addresses, and that definitely is non-compliant, whereas prefetching at the moment is not seen as a compliance problem. And also, given that cookies or consent management systems are strictly necessary anyway, so there's exceptions for security and compliance. So that also in the same way that frequency capping from impressions is an exception as well. Yeah, but it wouldn't be a bad idea to prefetch the consent management system domains, and or pre-render the JavaScript files, especially if using Autoblock, where it's a synchronous kind of script. I would say, just a note on OneTrust. Actually, what was a bigger problem for site speed on OneTrust is that OneTrust will scan through all JavaScript files, and it also scans parameters. So we've actually had instances in the past where a site had it was using a caching parameter like a v equals 1, 2, 3, 4, and what happened on each page, the caching parameter changed, even on a live site, and that caused the cookiebot file just to massively bloat. So setting OneTrust to remove URL parameters within its JavaScript file crawler is actually more like that had massive improvements on the size of the file and thus reduced site speed.
All right, thank you, Phil. So that was the last question of the day. Anything to add?
The only thing, well, not we ourselves, we're currently in the process. It wasn't quite ready for this webinar, but we've got a new tool that we're building for cookie compliance. So it's going to automatically audit the consent mode within GTM, and it will go through all of your tags and template tags and automatically put them in the right buckets. It's basically very similar to what Autoblock is doing with the Cookiepedia. We're just going to do this within GTM instead. It's going to be a free tool, and it's going to be another extension to our GTM cleaner. So if anyone wants kind of beta access to that beforehand, drop us a message and let us know. Yeah, and we're also on the lookout for like things that people want to talk about in the future. So if there's a particular burning problem or an issue that you're stuck on, let us know. And we're also kind of looking out for like guest speakers and stuff. If you want to email myself, it's phil@MeasureMindsGroup.com, and I can I'll put that in the chat, or Sarah, if you could just put it in the chat for me. Thanks. Yeah, so see if we've got any other kind of questions. Was there any questions on any bits on the slides that we'd mentioned earlier?
No, that was all of the questions.
Okay, cool. Ryan, you might be interested to know, for my sins, back in the day, I was actually part of the original W3C Do Not Track group. It's a bit like kind of, I was on the analytics side, and I was stuck between like the marketing networks on one side and the privacy groups on the other. It's like a really strange phone calls, but quite an interesting time. Cool, great. All right. Thanks everyone for that, and I said we'll kind of send an email follow up with resources afterwards. Yeah, I said if anyone's in Copenhagen, feel free to say hello, because I'm going to be around at the event on Saturday. All right, thanks everyone.